Good morning, learners. We are starting a new lesson today. We are starting lesson 19. We are going to explore scaled graphs. Now, as we start this new lesson, there are a lot of new vocabulary words that will help us to understand the ideas that we're learning about scaled graphs. So today I'm going to go over page 415 and 416 and really focus on the vocabulary and what a graph is. And then you'll do the practice page on your own. Now, as you go through this page with me, if I have stopped and written down some words and some definitions, it's a good idea that you do the same because those words we're going to use throughout this entire lesson. And actually, these words you're going to use in math for the rest of your life. So we want to make sure that you really understand these words. So let's go ahead and get started reading, and then we'll focus on the words that are helping us to understand the math. You have had practice modeling and solving word problems. In this lesson, you will use information from graphs to solve word problems. Use what you know to try to solve the problem below. Okay, now I notice here that I have a word problem here on the left side, and on the right side, I have a graph. Now, this is a special kind of graph called a picture graph, and so I've labeled it. It's a picture graph. It is a picture graph because they've used pictures to show the information in a graph. Now, if you're not quite sure what a graph is, I did put that over here. A graph is a way to organize information. So someone found some information or some numbers and they wanted to organize it so that other people could read it. So they've taken that information and they've put it in a graph so that it's easy to read. But we do have to learn how to read a graph, and that's what we're going to work on today. Okay, let's read our word problem. Ron keeps track of the points scored by his teammates during a basketball game. He records his data in the picture graph shown. How many points did each teammate score? Okay, the first thing I am trying to figure out is what is Ron doing? Ron, he keeps track of the points scored by his teammates. So he is finding information. We call that data. He is collecting some numbers. The numbers that he's collecting are the points that his teammates are scoring. And so we call that data. And Ron is going to use a graph to organize that data. He wants to organize that information so other people can read it. So that's what a graph is for. Now let's look at what we have to do with this graph. I'm going to read it again and see what they want us to do. Ron keeps track of the points scored by his teammates during a basketball game. He records his data in the picture graph shown. How many points did each teammate score? What's the question they're asking us? That's right. How many points did each teammate score? So before I can pull that information out, I need to make sure I understand everything about a picture graph and how to read a graph. So at this point, I'm going to kind of teach you how to read a graph, and then we'll come back and answer this question. Okay, let's make sure you understand all the information, all the words. Remember, a graph is a way to organize information. If you need to pause and write this down, it would be a really good idea to have this in your notebook so you can come back and look at it later. I also wrote down the definition for data. Say data. Data is a set of numbers or information. When we look at our graph, there's also something called a key. The key is really important. Kind of like a key to a house is really important. So a key tells you what the pictures mean. So in our picture graph here, we have pictures. Our picture is a basketball. And I noticed that for Alan and Kate and Gary and May, he has different numbers of basketballs. The key tells us what the basketball means. So I'm going to read that. It says key. Each basketball stands for 2 points. Okay, so the basketball is worth 2. Now that helps me to understand how I'm going to read the graph. So when I see a basketball, I have to think of 2 points. Okay, now looking at graphs actually is a very organized process. So when you look at a graph, there are 4 things that you need to do when you look at a graph. I've written them here, and then I'm going to use this as I go through this lesson. When I look at a graph, anytime you come to the graph, the first thing you want to do is read the title. You want to know what the graph is talking about. So if I read the title, points scored during the game. Okay? The second thing I want to do is look at the labels. Labels are all the other words. Now, in my labels, I notice that there is a teammate by the name of Alan, and Kate, and Gary, and May. Those are my labels. It tells me what the information is giving me. So it is telling me the points scored by Alan, points scored by Kate, points scored by Gary, and points scored by May. Now I have to find my key. The key is usually down at the bottom, or it might be over on the side. The key tells you how to read the graph. This key is telling me that the basketballs each stand for 2 points. So when I go to pull out the information, I'm going to count by 2s. Then, once I know everything that's in the graph, I get to pull out the information. So that means I get to go back now and figure out how many points Alan scored, Kate, Gary, and May. Okay, now that we know how to read a graph and we've taken the time to read this graph, let's go back and figure out how we can solve the question. Ron keeps track of points scored by his teammates during a basketball game. He records his data in the picture graph shown. How many points did each teammate score? Take a minute. Can you figure that out? If you need to, pause. Okay, did you figure out how many points everybody scored? Well, the key tells us to count the basketballs by 2s. So I actually, when I go to my graph, I can look at Alan and say, oh, 1 basketball. I can just put a 2 on there. Oh, that might be kind of hard to see. But here, he scored 2 points. Now I'm just going to count by 2s. Good thing we know our skip counting. How about Kate? 2, 4, 6. She scored 6 points. How about Gary? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. He scored 10 points during the game. And how about May? 2, 4, 6, 8. Now we know how to read the graph. We have pulled out the information. Remember, step 4 is to pull out the information. We know how many points each of the players scored. Okay, if you don't have the information that I have here, go ahead and pause the video and fill that information in. Okay, let's take a look at the other side. Now, up here, connect it. Number 1, look back. How many points did each teammate score? Explain. How did we figure that out? We did figure out the points. Remember, we wrote them down, but how did we figure that out? We skip counted by 2s to figure out how many points each player scored. Okay, let's go to number 2. Look ahead. The data in a picture graph can also be shown on a bar graph. A bar graph for these data is shown. Okay, let's pause there for a minute because they've just talked about a new type of graph. They talked about a bar graph. Over here, we have a bar graph. Go ahead and label your picture. This is a bar graph. Do you know why this is called a bar graph? We have bars. Notice the bars. Instead of pictures, we have bars. Now, sometimes in a bar graph, our bars go horizontally, but sometimes you've seen graphs before in which our bars are vertical and they go up and down. These are going left to right. A bar graph can go either direction. Okay, now there's a little bit different information here. So I'm going to pause here. And here is my looking at a graph notes. So I like to have index cards, or, I like to have cards that help me to learn my math. So I took the information from this side. Remember, we wrote down how to look at graphs, and I put it on a card. And so now as I work on lesson 19, I can just take out my card and it tells me what to do. So if you have just a piece of paper or a notebook, you can put this in your notebook and have this on the side as you do your work, and you can use it to help you read graphs. Now remember, looking at a graph, the first thing we want to do is read the title. Let's read the title. Points scored during the game. Oh, that's the same as the picture graph. Let's look at the labels. We have some new labels this time. We have students over here. It says students. And down here it says number of points scored. Okay, so a bar graph has some different labels. Now it also has our students, Alan, Kate, Gary, and May. So now that I've read all my words, all my labels, I'm going to find the key. But I noticed there's not a key because there's not a picture. So in a bar graph, we look for something called a scale. Okay, and I wrote it down here. The scale is the difference between the numbers. So notice that we go from 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Did they write down all the numbers? No, they skip counted. So a scale tells us what to count by. We are going to count by twos, which is the same thing we did in our picture graph because the key told us to count by twos. Our scale, and if you want to, you can draw an arrow. That's what I'm going to do. So this is the scale. The scale is right here. It's the numbers. It's what we're going to count by. Okay, now we can pull out our information. Now, Alan, I'm going to look at my bar. His bar stops at 2. So he scored 2 points. If I look at Kate, 2, 4, 6. She scored 6 points. Let's look at Gary. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And May. 2, 4, 6, 8. There we go. We were able to pull out the information based on what we read in the graph. Now, whenever you have a word problem and graphs, it is a really good idea to make sure you understand the graph before you try working on the word problem. Because if you know what the graph is about, then you know how to answer the questions. So now let's come back over to our word problem. The scale on a bar graph is the difference between any two numbers that are next to each other along the bottom or left side of the graph. Okay, remember, this is the scale. It tells us what to count by. It's the difference between the numbers. These numbers are called scale numbers. Okay. What is the scale of this bar graph? What are we counting by on this scale? We are counting by twos. So our scale on our graph here is 2. What does the bar for Gary mean? How do you know? Okay, so Gary's bar, how many points is that? We figured that out. It's 10. It is 10. And how do we know? We counted by twos. Right? We counted the length of his bar by twos. Okay, how do the key for the picture graph and the scale for the bar graph compare? Explain how each helps you to read the graph. Okay, so what does the key do? Remember, the key, it tells us what each picture means. right? The key on a picture graph tells us what each picture means. What about the scale? The scale tells us the difference between the numbers. And how do they help us to read the graph? Well, a key tells us what the picture means. A scale tells us the difference between the numbers. But the important thing is they tell us how to count. They tell us how to count. So each one's a little bit different. The key tells us about what the picture means. The scale tells us the difference between the numbers, but they both tell us how to count. Okay, so in number 3, I would like for you to tell me, how are the picture graph and the bar graph alike and different in showing the same data? Take what you've learned here and write down, what's the same thing? What's similar about a bar graph and a picture graph? And what is different about them? Okay, when you get finished, go ahead and pause, and then what I would like for you to do is begin working on the practice page on your own. Take what you've known from our worksheet. Can you tell me what a picture graph, a bar graph, a key, and a scale are, and draw an example? Then go ahead and try to answer the questions on your own, and when you're done, come back to video number 2 and we'll go over it.